And okay, I believe we're live. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Terra Prime Live 7th Forum Symposium 2020. We have a really great show. We're going to be talking about the future of sabering and how sabering fits into the future of martial arts. Lots of stuff has happened this year. We've got the pandemic thing going on around the world, which has disrupted a whole lot of stuff. But it has allowed a lot of us to kind of get back down to ground and reorganize stuff. And going forward, we don't know exactly how everything is going to change, but the lightsaber community and the lightsaber art is something that is full of that type of spirit. So we're hoping to energize the conversation and everything like that for today. But so today we have three very special guests joining us in the discussion along with our council members. So I'll give a quick little introduction to that. We will start over here. I'm just going to go across the bar that I have on my screen. So no particular order. We'll start with Fabrice Patin. He is a Masters of Arms from France in the ASL FFE and Master of Arms with the FFE. How are you doing, Fabrice?
Yeah. So I'm Fancy Master in Brittany, a part of France with a great identity.
Yeah.
A marvelous castle in my hometown behind me. I used to do fencing, classics fencing with my students, saber, sword, rapier, German longsword, and I used to work too in opera drama, and for some films quite a bit. My favorite part of action is choreography and stunt and horse and on foot.
Excellent.
Okay.
Very good.
Lightsaber with Cedric.
Yes.
All night.
Yes. Cedric, our knight, is not able to be with us. He is vacationing. So we send out salutations to him. Anyway, so next up we have Serge Timachev, who is the press officer from the FIE. You're the editor of USA Fencing magazine. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm the press officer for the FIE. I was their Olympic photographer for 15 years, and now I do all their press and media. I'm based in Seattle. I'm also a fencing club owner, a former competitive international fencer, and I've worked with USA Fencing also for many years. I'm the editor of American Fencing magazine. I do a lot of work with fencing equipment manufacturers as well, especially Absolute Fencing, which is the world's largest fencing equipment manufacturer. They're also one of the biggest HEMA equipment manufacturers with a brand called Absolute Force. The lightsaber area is new to me a little bit, and I got involved when the French Federation adopted LED saber, and I became very interested in it, and I by default became the spokesperson for the FIE about it. And I'm currently working on a project where I'm talking to all of the councils and commissions within the International Fencing Federation about LED saber and how we can support it and review it and consider it. So the pandemic sort of put a little bit of a stop to it, and the whole process with the Olympic Games being put off and all of the disruption from this year caused some hiccups in everything we were doing. But by the same token, it also gives us an opportunity, because right now the Fencing Federation has no events this year, so we all have a little more time to catch up on things that we otherwise wouldn't be doing. So we're working on a lot of procedures and updates of handbooks and regulations, and now is sort of an interesting time for people to have a little bit of extra space in their schedules, I think, to be able to take a serious look at LED Saber. All of the interest that I've seen within fencing has been fascinating, because I think there are so many traditional hardcore Olympic fencing people in world fencing that they have not stopped to consider LED Saber, other than the French Federation. And now, because the French Federation did that, and when I talk to people, they at first say, lightsaber, I don't, I don't think so. And then I start talking to them, and then by the end of the conversation, they go, yeah, maybe so. Why not? So it's an interesting process of talking to people who are traditionally engrossed in fencing in a classical style, and to expand their minds to look forward. And so I'm looking at this time period in our history as one of opportunity and hope and evolution. Fencing has evolved very much in the last 10 years to 15 years in terms of technology, how we present our sport. So for example, we had the World Championships in Wuxi, China 2 years ago, where everything, the entire floor, the entire field of play was a giant video screen. And we've done so much with technology that now fencing is considered a leader in technology and sports overall. And a lot of other sports are looking to fencing for interesting innovations in technology. So I think the timing is actually hopeful, and I'm looking towards what we can do with LED Saber, and that's why I've recently joined the board with Terra Prime, and so I'm hoping that I can be sort of a champion of LED Saber within the FIE, and that we can work our way into the organization at a grassroots level.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good.
This is something that's going to be growing there. And so, yeah, and then to round off today, we have a very special guest. Me being from Chinese martial arts, this is a name that I'm very familiar with for most of my career. He comes from Kung Fu Tai Chi magazine, the former editor, Gene Ching. Welcome to the program, sir.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. Sadly, Kung Fu Tai Chi magazine was a casualty of the pandemic.
Yeah.
Print publishing is a difficult thing, and to be honest, had it not been for our parent company, Tire Claw, the print magazine should have gone down a decade ago. But beyond that, I'm also a former NC2A fencer. I fenced for San Jose State under Maestro Michael Tesaro. I also prévôt the arms, the scream, pardon my French. I specialized in épée. I also did kendo for years. I'm a Shaolin disciple of Shaolin Temple, second generation, and spent a lot of time training in China. I also did kendo for my college years, and Iaido for my graduate school years. I was a weapons expert on the El Rey show, Man at Arms Art of War with Danny Trejo, where we reconstructed traditional weapons and then some fantasy weapons, and then tested them. But well, not the fantasy weapons, but for the traditional weapons, historic weapons, we used traditional techniques. And I used to work for American Fencer Supply, which was a major fencing supply company specializing in the armory division, where we made historical swords predominantly for theater, like Shakespearean theater. So they had to be combat worthy, because actors don't necessarily know how to use a sword very well, and they're banging it against each other. but they also had to be kind of stripped down so they could decorate as they pleased, and also had to be a component like a fencing weapon where you could break it apart and reassemble it. So if they broke a guard or something, we could ship that out, and not halt up the production too much.
Sure.
And also, I used to import antique Chinese weapons. That's how I paid for some of my trips to China. This was back before the internet, when finding Chinese weapons in the United States was very difficult. And
Yes.
so, and the market, the dollar was different versus their RMB, and so I could pick up weapons fairly inexpensively. And I'm not talking like ancient antiques, mostly Republic of China stuff.
Sure.
And turn those around to help finance my trips. So, and I'm a huge Star Wars fan, so it's a delight to be here. Yoda's one of my nicknames, so there you go.
Very good. Yes. And we have the rest of our council here. We have Anthony, Damon, Ben, Matt. Hopefully we'll have some people kind of trickle in maybe here, in a little bit, but we can totally start the conversation here. So we're all coming from sort of different places, but we're all kind of arriving at the same place. Recently, lightsaber being accepted by the FFE in France, and it kind of spreading out over, is gaining a lot of popularity here. There's tons of little dueling clubs that are popping up all over the place. We've been on the scene since 2012, and we've seen the kind of evolution of the communities since that time. Now, when we arrived, it had already been going. Damon, you were around at the beginning of that time. In fact, you're probably one of the people who founded the entire thing, if you're going to say that it started with New York Jedi in New York in the early 2000s. But as we've gone through, because when we came on the scene, nobody was doing the sport, nobody was doing the fighting, nobody was wearing gear. It was all just choreography and kind of cosplay and that kind of thing. And then, all that kind of stuff. Now what we have is we have a extremely diverse martial landscape, from everything from sport with the fencing stuff, which is great. That's been something that we've been really wanting to do since we started, is come up with rule sets for this kind of stuff. But you also have the people who are training it like a traditional martial art. You have people who are using it for personal growth. You have people who are using it for stage and, and all of that. And we've talked about the different benefits of it all. But why don't we open it to you guys? The benefits that you're seeing with the lightsaber, now, like from this point in history right here, what's most interesting to you guys? And we can, anybody wants to go.
I can talk about France.
Sure.
As Sage says, it's a brand new ways to fence in France, and we have to invent rules to produce a way to fight together, and we have to have a good way to oppose themselves. We have to do some referee, and when you wanna have a sportive competition, you have to add referee, and it was really difficult to form referees in lightsaber. Because it's fast. Your referee will be tired very quickly because of the light, of the darkness, and so on. It's quite difficult, and nowadays it's our major trouble to have enough referee to have a good competition in matter of time, of a way, of rounds, and so on. So it's as in traditional Olympic fencing, no referee, no place.
Right. Yeah, that's very true. Gene, what's I mean, besides the Star Wars angle, you know, what's the magic here?
The magic. Well, you know, from a professional standpoint, from a martial arts economy standpoint, it's kind of a gateway practice, and we've seen this kind of phenomena before with other cultural movements. Ninja Turtles was a huge one that schools would promote that. Same with Kung Fu Panda, sort of kids programs and somewhat themed off of, you know, like with Ninja Turtles, you could do a whole series on the various weapons that the turtles had. So do the nunchuck, the tonfa, the staff and sword. Kung Fu Panda, you had the different animal styles, and even with the Klingon Batleth, to some degree, you had the pop culture media influence, this huge franchise that becomes sort of a gateway. It's another way for studios, for private martial arts studios, to try to entice more people to come in. I think what's fascinating about lightsaber, well, two qualities. One, that Ninja Turtles and Kung Fu Panda, they're kid shows, so they were targeting kids or more oriented to kids. You wouldn't really attract adults who want to be, you know, Michelangelo, right? With lightsaber, you have a much wider demographic of adults and kids, because a lot of the people that are, you know, like me, I mean, I was raised on Star Wars. That was my generation. You know, I remember when when the first movie came out and the whole thing blew up. And so, you know, it's more family oriented, or it attracts a much more adult demographic. The other thing I think find that's really fascinating is because of the nature of it being an actual intellectual property of, well, Disney now. That is in the same manner that the Batleth was a property of Paramount's. You can't really call it, you know, you can't really evoke Star Wars. You can't really call it lightsaber officially. There's been lawsuits and cease and desist. I'm sure you guys have dealt with that. So what that does to certain degrees, it drives it underground and has to be redefined, you know. So it becomes like Tai Chi, you know. I'm convinced that Tai Chi is one of the largest practices of any martial arts in the world. But because it's so grassroots, you know, there's no way to figure out, you know, how many schools are teaching it, how many hospitals are teaching it, how many people are doing it in parks, how many senior centers are teaching it. What is that number? On the same notion with lightsaber, with sabering, how many people are doing it? I mean, you've got multiple organizations. There's you guys, there's Ludo Sport, there's that Glow Sword, there's all these different kind of groups, and they're all kind of a different angle on it. So I'm convinced that that sabering is the largest growing phenomena in martial arts right now. I mean, MMA peaked about 5-10 years ago. You know, it's established itself, and it's still progressing, but we aren't seeing that just incredible growth arc we saw when it first came out, you know, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Lightsabering or sabering is just taking off, and with this whole new acknowledgement from the French Fencing Association, it's really captivating. And I'm really intrigued with what Serge said about the tech and how that's been improving. I've been watching the fencing games, the international games, and been noticing just how high tech and how beautiful the presentation is being. It really is intriguing that this becomes, you know, the bold new frontier.
I mean, it does make sense though, Serge, I know, and I'll throw it over to you, that the tech aspect of it, because I mean, fencing probably is the most tech savvy of these of these sports, martial arts, or what have you, because a lot of times we're so seeped in either history or an imagined history, you know, that we're trying to recreate, you know, with this stuff. But
Well, you know, I think the challenge is, as with many sports, the transition from what it was to what it can be. You know, if you look back, you know, when fencing was a legitimate form of fighting, I mean, you know, we have a couple of kids in our fencing club who every now and then you ask why, what made you interested about fencing? Why do you want to fence? And every now and then a kid will say, well, for self-defense. It's not really the best form of self-defense anymore if you're going to walk down the streets of Compton. But, you know, there was a transition period a long time ago where it went from a fighting, a form of actual fighting and self-defense and to a sport, right? And in more recent times, we've seen other sports do the same thing. Say, for example, skateboarding or surfing or snowboarding, right? So the International Skiing Federation, the FIS, they adopted snowboarding as a full separate sport within their organization. They had to have different venues. They had to have different rules. They had to have different judges. They had to have, you know, everything was different, yet it was still part of it. And so there was a process that skiing went through to adopt snowboarding as a legitimate form of snow competition, snow-based competition. And so we're going through a similar cycle. And at that time, there were many different organizations and splinter organizations within snowboarding, and they sort of congealed. And so the French Federation being involved in lightsaber adds a great deal of credibility and helps us sort of leapfrog some of this, because people go, oh, well, if the French are doing it, then I guess it must be legitimate, right? And this is not to denigrate any other countries, but, you know, I mean, if, you know, there are many other countries you can imagine. If they took up lightsaber as a competitive sport within their fencing federation, people would not look at it quite as seriously as they do of the French, who are, you know, arguably one of the originators of our sport. And it started, you know, the Olympics started in France with fencing, you know, with Pierre de Coubertin. And, you know, so for us, this adds a great deal of credibility, and it helps us. And I think that people understand that, you know, there's a lot going on in the world with video games and movies and kids sitting at home, not getting exercise, and even adults sitting at home not getting exercise. And so I think the exercise element, the sport element, the competition element of it is just now kicking in. But instead of coming from fighting or self-defense, it's coming from entertainment and turning into a competitive arena, which is the new concept that everyone has to sort of migrate to and accept, that this is a legitimate, this isn't just show, this isn't just entertainment, this is actual competition that people want to train for. They want to win medals. They want to, you know, become world champions in another type of sport. And so we're in this process now. And then we're also in the process of everything, all these splinter groups around the world congealing into something common that we can lock into as, yes, this is the way to do it, and this is how we're going to do it together. Because right now that's sort of diverse.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that has, like you said, that has parallels in, you know, in other areas. Now, a lot of us are from traditional martial art, and I can go through here. HEMA is, of course, something that is a little bit closer to kind of what we're doing, even though they're doing the same thing with historical sources. We don't have any historical sources. We're just making them up. So actually, in reality, we have all of the historical sources because we can use them. Anyway, how about anybody else on the panel? Experiences with the integrating lightsaber with your art. Anybody want to jump on that one? Anthony? Yes, you are. Yes.
I have to turn my mic on.
There you go.
It was actually easy because, you know, like Gene, I was in the theater as a kid and I saw Darth Vader light up his saber, you know, against Obi-Wan, and I was hooked. So my entire, 2 years later, I started training in martial arts. It was like, okay, when do I get to hold a lightsaber? So the integration of lightsaber into the arts was always there for me, but the really enlightening thing for me was when I met Chad and started bringing lightsaber into my school and noticing that people's interest in weapon training grew exponentially, because it's completely different. It's not this scary, daunting thing anymore. It's, oh my goodness, I get to be a Jedi or a Sith, or, I get to play with this awesome lightsaber. And so people that would never have even considered weapon training are joining because they just see what this is, and just the allure of that whole thing has made it quite relevant for weapon training. So I'm really happy about that. It was something I didn't see coming, to be honest with you. The first time that I said, yeah, I'm going to have a lightsaber class, I figured maybe 3 or 4 people would show up, and we had like 20 people the first day. People a couple of people I knew, and a lot that I never met before. So it's quite surprising. And given the martial art that I do, it was a perfect fit. So that's pretty much it.
Back in the early days, because I was doing it in 2006, 2007, when I first went to the Jedi that were all hanging out in New York, I got some resistance from other martial arts colleagues of mine, because they're like, what?
Yeah.
Because it was very, very new back then. And it was a huge experiment to take a martial practice and apply it to a different worldview. And the same happened, that I agree 100% with Anthony. It's like other people that would be intimidated by a traditional martial setting, wherever its origin, somehow that tension is really alleviated, and people come in and just build themselves in a very remarkable way. I think it's very successful and awesome, and crosses a lot of boundaries. I think it's great.
Yeah. And the addition of the sporting aspect of it with rules and competitions, like you were saying, Serge, opens up another venue for, like there is something that you can do. There's something you can accomplish within this. This isn't just a complete diversion anymore.
Yeah, Serge, back when we fought, all I did is had people wrap their sabers in bubble wrap, and we just fought each other. We were just crazy. Like kids training in the woods with Boken smacking each other in the face. Yeah. It's just like we were just trying to figure it out. And now this whole infrastructure it's really exciting, fascinating.
Yeah, it absolutely is.
Hey, Damon, I wanted to kind of add to something that you said about, some people didn't know how to take it. I actually had a martial artist that I've known for a while. He sent me a private message one day, concerned about my reputation. Because he's like, hey, man, people aren't going to take you seriously anymore. And I'm like,
yeah,
okay.
I hear you.
Yeah. We play with swords. We're not used to being taken seriously anyway. So that's not a
I have a question for all our panelists. What do you think was the tipping point where people saw it differently than that? For me in the early years, got a lot of certain resistance, but a lot of inspiration. And now all of a sudden people just get inspired. Do you think it's just a kind of critical mass thing? Do you think it's people see people with different levels of skill and get inspired, or all of it, or what do you think? That's my question to all three of you.
No, it's a good one.
Generally, when Chad and I initially saw this as a way to get people in through the pop culture appeal,
Mm-hmm.
We hadn't been getting a lot of response from just using historic swords, historic weapons, and the advent of a fightable stunt saber. It opened a door that we'd been looking for.
True.
I mean, a lot of the people who are coming into lightsaber that we see are not necessarily ones who have a traditional background in fencing. So, you know, there are some, and I've seen, like, for example, I saw this video of this French policeman who had been fencing for 20 years or something, and now he's been fencing lightsaber for 3 years and he loves it. And, you know, but I'm not sure that he's typical. I think a lot of the traditional, I had a discussion with the fencing, fencing master at our club, who's a saber fencer, former Olympic saberist, and you know, he's interested, but I don't think he's interested enough to start teaching it. You know, I think that it's a different segment, and I kind of return to this snowboarding concept because it's not, you know, getting a snowboarder to ski or getting a skier to snowboard are not easy things. And by the same token, I don't know that we're necessarily going to have a lot of epeists who become lightsaber fencers or people who are in lightsaber who then transition over to regular fencing or to traditional fencing rather. And so I think we have to look at it as a new community, and we have to address it that way. So there's a common denominator of it being linked to martial arts, to fencing, to other sports. But I think that we have to look at it as a whole new entity and with a new identity and a new persona, and as a sport, as a, you know, and not as a game. So I think that's the tipping point, is for people to make that transition in their mind and decide that that might be something of interest to them, that, hey, I was never really interested in fencing like I saw on TV at the Olympics or something, but lightsaber, that sounds cool. You know, I'll try that. And the same place that would teach traditional fencing might teach lightsaber. And that's why I'm so interested in how we can sort of build a broad set of people who are well-versed in teaching lightsaber with a common practice and common rules and common regulations and common equipment, etc. Because the more consistency we have, the faster the process will take place of it sort of hitting that critical mass for everybody to be picking it up and to feel behind if they haven't.
Yeah. I agree.
And I think that, you know, we've got, so one other thing is, I think we have a lot of, I know internationally as well as in the US, we've got a lot of fencing clubs who are hanging by a thread right now, financially and economically. And like my club is one of them. And, you know, and this might be a good time for them to see a new way to expand and develop revenue for their clubs, and to make their clubs survive by transitioning into a new area that they hadn't thought of before, that brings in more people and more money and more opportunity for the club.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, the French Federation at the beginning of this last year announced that I think they were, I can't remember if it was 50 clubs or something, maybe Fabrice knows, but they're, they, you know, they were providing financial incentive to clubs to take on lightsaber.
I agree with you, Serge. We have two kind of clubs. We have fencing clubs who open lightsaber class. Not necessarily it's the master who teach. Mostly it's someone who is just a student of Olympic class who teach, because he is get involved in lightsabering. The second parts are club who are not get involved in French Federation, but join us because of the rules, because of the security, because of the way to qualify our teacher, and so on.
Right.
And in France, we've got 200 lightsaber club.
Okay.
And
Wow.
you know, what's interesting is that with the pandemic too, fencing is like this, but I think lightsaber is like this even more, is that it's the perfect socially distancing sport. I mean, you don't have to physically come into contact with your opponent as much.
Right. Right. Yeah. And as long
Yeah,
as you have the way to clean the mask, or you just use your own,
Mm.
you
Well,
know.
they've got those new fencing masks now that have the built-in breathing masks. They're just starting to come out with those.
Yeah, I've seen. Yeah, those are probably better. Something that goes right over there. I've seen the ones that are like, I think Leon Paul put them out. They're like in the mask,
Yeah,
and all I can see is just a big plume coming over that mask, because there's like, it's not like up against your face. But
Hey, Gene,
yeah,
to kind of redirect Damon's question, you've had your ear to the ground for a lot of years. When was the first time you became aware of lightsaber combat as a thing? And at what point did you see it begin to pick up steam? Like, how did you find out about us?
Wow, how did I find out about? Well, on our forum, we've been kind of the KungFuMagazine.com forum. We've been discussing lightsaber. There's a whole thread dedicated to Jedi academies, which I actually posted this event on just this morning, and I can't remember the date of that. It's got to be over 10 years now when it started. And surely when it began, it was mocked. I mean, I think well, particularly in the forums, and particularly 10 years ago when the forums were a lot more volatile and we were dealing with a lot, before the other social medias like medium like Facebook rose up, when online discussion forums were more viable, and we had more flame wars, particularly within the martial arts community. There's a certain neuroses in martial arts that a lot of practitioners get very defensive, because you put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into your practice, and there's that sort of validity that have you ever really been tested? Have you succeeded in tournaments? Well, that's one measure. But the people that actually compete in tournaments, that's only a small population of a much larger community. So people are always trying to sort of justify their practice. And I mean, we talk about, I'm a weapons guy too, obviously. The practicality of learning, like the Guandao is one of my favorite weapons, which is this ridiculously heavy horseman's lance, which of course, I'm never going to have one of those, at the ready if some perp attacks me in the alley, or even somebody breaks into my house. I'm not going to. Honestly, my weapon of choice, I've studied dozens, if not hundreds, of different kinds of traditional weapons, and my weapon of choice, if I had that choice, would be a sharpened epee, because that's what I did the most competition with, and that's what I'm the fastest with. But anyway, going back to your question of validity, I think there's certainly still a lot of hesitation within the community of martial arts. And I think a lot of that stems from the fact that the notion of a popular franchise being the source of inspiration is novel. Again, coming back to the Star Trek Batleth, where there's this invented weapon, and there's sort of this mythology, or I mean, you could Joseph Campbell the hell out of Star Wars. It has these same sort of tropes and concepts and morals that that classic myth has. And within the traditional martial arts, we actually see plenty of examples of classic myths playing out. So, for example, like I mentioned, the Guandao, right? That's named after Lord Guan, who's the patron saint of martial arts. He was a general in the spring and autumn period. So we're talking, 200 before Common Era. He had this mythic weapon, and in classic sort of ludic recombination, according to this 14th century novel, which tells the whole story of it, they're very good. The weapon was 100 pounds, right? Which, of course, anybody who does any sort of weapon play realizes it's ridiculous, But it was one of those things like you exaggerate that. Okay, this guy was a great warrior, so we had this great heavy weapon like what Chad is showing right there. And actually, that looks like a fairly. How much does that weigh, Chad? I can't quite see. Probably.
I think this is pretty light. This is only about 6 pounds.
So that weapon actually became part of the military examinations in China. the ridiculously heavy one. And you still see some people who will practice with like these 80-pound, 100-pound Guandao for training. Obviously, there's no practicality to it. Obviously, it never existed as a real weapon, but it evokes this myth, you know, and that is actually very pervasive within the Chinese martial arts. Another big example would be the monkey staff. So many styles have the monkey staff, which evokes the Monkey King out of Journey to the West, which was, you know, it was a monkey god, and he had this staff that was originally the pillar under the sea held by the Dragon King, and it could expand to be infinitely huge or tucked down to the size of a toothpick that he could keep behind his ear and just whip it out like a switchblade and have this huge staff. Now, so many traditional styles have monkey staffs, and there's actually a competition in China that's just monkey style kung fu. So all the guys just all do monkey, and it's very connected to opera, where they'll be doing, you know, this sort of monkey poses and kind of imitating monkey, you know, like that was some sort of deceptive technique that you would do when you were fighting. But really, it's more of an homage to myth. It's more of there's an intrinsic or embedded lesson in that story, several lessons really, and that's where we get the inspiration. Now with Star Trek and Star Wars, there's a lot of morality. You know, there are moral plays. You know, there's metaphor, there's analogy, there's you know, I mean, at the simplest level, there's good versus evil, but then you know, you have all these comments on diversity, you have all these comments on, you know, on friendship, on loyalty, on faith. You know, those are all still very inspirational in a modern sense, and it's just that stigma that now with movies and the merchandising, you know, the lightsabers are toys, right? You know, it's like it's not the same as say these myths that were depicted, you know, in the Guandao or the monkey staff or what have you, that were also, you know, completely fabricated in a sense. You know, I mean, they're also actually really good examples of fabricated weapons, but there are other ones that are much more, you know, clearly weapons that you look at and go, that I don't think this was a real weapon, you know, and we don't find any historic evidence of it or archaeologic evidence of some of those weapons. You know, at the same time, people have trained with them and they've learned to use them, and they've sort of reinstalled a validity, which is kind of fascinating, you know. So I can see Chad's like pulling stuff out, which is awesome.
He has a great collection of both fun and unusual weapons.
Yeah, so here's a good weapon of what like Gene is talking about. The cicada wing.
The cicada wing, yeah.
Right. This thing appears, as far as I can tell, in the 20th century. It has the little halberds on it, so we know it's Chinesey, but I mean, what is this thing? You know? So it's, you know, when you talk about lightsaber being based on something that's not real, there's a lot of legitimate martial arts which are based on stuff which is not real. Right? I mean, it's either based on theater, like you're talking about monkey staff, all of that. That's the popular entertainment of the day too. You know, sure. People are taking those myths and bringing those in to evoke things in people.
I think every sport, well, many sports have evolved from something else. You know, and not just martial arts or fighting sports, but say, for example, equestrian, or, you know, I mean,
yeah,
horses were functional. Now they're used for sport, right? You look at basketball, started as, you know, the ball courts back in the Mayan, you know, ball courts.
Yeah.
I mean, many sports do this in one way or another. Archery, for example, and you know, I think that something that's kind of interesting here is that we have to get to a certain degree away from the Star Wars stigma and let LED Saber take on its own form factor and its own recognition as a standalone and not something that's directly connected to something else, whether it's a form of true fighting or it's a entertainment or whatever, so that you can look at it independently. I mean, nobody thinks about archery as a fighting, weapon, or something like that, and these days, yet if you read history about it, you'll read about that. And one day you'll read about LED saber and realize that the origins were, but there might be kids, 20, 30, 40 years from now who are competing in lightsaber, and they'll say, Star Wars, what's that? Right. And we're not there yet, but we're in this transition. The interesting thing is that instead of taking something from the past that has evolved into a sport, we're taking something from the future that we're evolved, kind of reverse evolution here to create a sport that hasn't yet become a true fighting sport, right?
Right. Exactly.
But yet, I think that what I'm really trying to say though is that LED Saber has to take on its own persona and its own identity as a competition sport, and get away from all the other stigma and everything. It will never fully separate itself from it, but we have to get to the point that it stands alone.
Absolutely. And coming up with rule sets, with having goals and competitions and all that kind of thing really, really helps that. Even having like what you're doing in France with the choreography, coming up with systems of choreography so that it's not just kind of coming up with it off the top of your head. There are methods and there are things there, and that's been our thing. It's like, this is a legitimate martial practice. Like you mentioned archery. Who thinks of archery as a martial art right now? But if you go to the Ming Dynasty and you look through any of those military manuals, the #1 martial art that you must learn is archery if you're in the military, period. That was the highest form of martial art. But now, like you said, it's a sport. It's like that. It's a little trickier with the associations with Star Wars and with all of that kind of thing.
Yeah, Star Wars is a big beast. I don't know how you're going to divorce from that.
You're not going to necessarily, and you don't necessarily want to divorce completely from it.
It's no different than referring to kids in a fencing class as being musketeers.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And like I said, I have had a good number of kids who have come to my class who have never seen anything Star Wars. No cartoons, no movies, no nothing. They just like the glowing sword, right? You get this going, and like I tell people, we'll set up in a mall. I'll have a couple of lightsabers, and I won't say anything about Star Wars or anything like that. We'll just turn on the lightsabers, and we'll have those glowing swords. We'll see who attracts more people, right? People love this thing, right? You give this to anybody, and they will start immediately like making sound effects, quoting the movies, all kind of stuff. You give somebody a sword, even a wushu sword, which is all floppy. The first thing they ask you is it real or is it sharp?
Yeah.
Both things mean, will it hurt me? You never get that question with this.
Right. If malls ever open again, we can do that.
But
that's a good parking lots in our future right now. Parks and parking lots.
Yes.
It kind of intrigues me, the notion of sportification, because sportification of the martial arts has been happening since the 16th century when we start seeing firearms, and every time something sportifies, it changes because, ordinarily in the martial arts, you have this reality of combat, right? And so particularly in fencing, if you look back even a couple decades ago, the way we fenced was much different because of it still had the trappings of this, this very lethal dueling. Now with the electrification of the weapon, things are changing. So, for example, now you'll have to forgive me, and Serge and Fabrice can kind of correct me on this, right? So the old when I dropped out of fencing, was right when Saber was starting to electrify. And at that point, we had the motion sensors. This is a standard Saber, which would register impact, and then you had your whole lame and stuff, and everything was all. So you'd have one that would register impact and one that completed circuit. Now I understand now that the weapons electrified, and you no longer have. It's like a typical, like the old school point, right? And it's any contact on the upper body or the lame area, it will register a touch.
Yeah, it just takes one electron to jump from the metal to metal for a point to be scored in Saber.
Right.
No
So I mean, that's got to shift the game in the sense. Like, I mean, back when we had standard Saber, the Saber, this was the cutting edge, and then you also had like the false Saber, the back of it was the cutting edge. But now, I mean, I could hit with the flat and touch, right? Which opens up a whole really kind of crazy thing when you start thinking about, lightsabers as lightsabers versus the notion of LED weapons where, I mean, obviously we don't have real lightsabers, so we have no real sense of what they might be. One of the things that that's kind of part of canon with what was it, Star Wars Rebels, the trials of the Darksaber, where she talks about picking up the Darksaber, and at first it's super heavy and it's really old, and then as she starts to learn it and starts to channel through it, it lightens up. So we kind of make these assumptions about how a lightsaber might work, and it's kind of based on our conventions of how we visualize swordplay. So like the most for lightsaber, for example, I mean the closest thing is you have your kendos, your shinai, right? But the shinai has the tsuru. I think that's the tsuru is called the cord, and that defines the back edge. So in kendo, because it's a do, I have to hit in a very precise way. My stance has to be correct. My ki has to call out where I'm hitting, and I can't hit flat. I can't hit with this side. I can only hit with the opposite of where this cord is.
There's sort of a style element.
Well, I mean, there's still this recollection of a blade. Like in old school fencing, we talked a lot about pronation and supination because you wanted the blade to be flat so it could penetrate the ribs. Nowadays, that's not very important. Electric fencing, nobody really worries about it as much. And with saber, really was about that. Now, one of the things in terms of the way Star Wars is choreographed, I mean, it's all based on our knowledge of martial arts. So as we sportify this, it kind of opens up a whole avenue of kind of different techniques. How does it touch? There's no blade. That's the kind of the crazy thing about lightsabers. You chuck that whole thing out. Like blade orientation is just.
Well, there's a lot of different origins of things like that. The reason that saber is you can only have a legitimate touch from the waist up. You know why that is? It's because
cavalry.
Cavalry. It's because you would be doing on a horse, and you would be trying to hit somebody on the body, and you don't want to hit the horse because the objective was to kill the rider and keep the horse because it was more valuable. And we explain that to kids and stuff, but the interesting thing I think about lightsaber is it's not a weapon in the same way that other weapons are weapons. And like we hit a lot of resistance, for example, with school districts. Even the University of Washington allows no swords in dormitories, right? Well, you could take a lightsaber in there. I mean, it wouldn't meet those criteria. It's not a weapon in the same way. I mean, you could take it as a carry-on on an airplane.
Exactly.
You could bypass administrative policies of school districts to get lightsaber into a kid's program where you couldn't take an epee or a kendo sword or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is that you have to carry these on if they have a lithium ion battery in them.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
So you have to you take the blade out, you put it in a like a document canister, or something like that. And you carry. And if you're in the EU, you have to do not check your lightsabers in the EU. They will confiscate them.
So funny.
Yes. But anyway,
So
um,
it's a different definition of weapon that way.
yes, exactly. And that's the other thing too, is we've talked about this, like as far as the use goes. Yes, we're basing it on Star Wars, but Star Wars isn't based on one thing. It's based on a whole bunch of things, and it's coming up with something that's entertaining. And we set up, and this is what's really great about the rule set that Cedric came up with for the FFV, is that it incorporates that feel, and it allows you to do something that you can do with this weapon. You can't do anything else. I can start by using this, like say a rapier, and then immediately change to using it like a saber, and then immediately use it like a long sword, right? And I don't have to change weapons, and I can do this within a point, right? So, I mean, obviously this is probably more relevant to people like who are in HEMA, who are using different weapons, right? So you can take your Dussac stuff and combine it with your, you know, kind of rapier stuff, because it's not defined with this weapon or with this tool, right? The blade, we don't really have a flat or an edge. It's all there, and it's light enough that we can pretty much use it however we want, which makes for a really dynamic way of gameplay. And like you said, we have to treat it as its own thing, because if you start treating it like, oh, I'm just going to do this like kendo, then it's just going to look like kendo with a glowing shinai, you know, or vice versa, you know.
I think
Which, for the
one thing-
record, looks really cool.
Right.
I think one thing that they hit on that and we're all talking about is definitely the myth and the story behind it. It's like we have a modern space opera telling us and inspiring us to do something with kind of embodied archaic knowledge of sword work. And to go to early in the discussion when Fabrice was talking about telling a story with the choreography, that's the first thing my opera teacher said, is like, you're moving too fast. No one can see what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
You have to bring the audience in with you. And it's the same thing. We finally have a story to bring people to the consciousness of using maybe any type of weapon.
Yeah.
And taking stuff into schools. I mean, I think that's amazing. Kids, I mean, they'll love that. Kids want stories. We all want stories.
Yeah, and even if it's just the story of two people being pitted together, and that's why combat sports are always so popular, even to this day. There's something primal and satisfying about just two people, you know, equally matched. Let's see who comes out on top, you know.
And I feel like the lightsaber with two people, it's because look at the diverse martial practices we have in this forum here. You know, the lightsaber allows us to let go of a rapier and let go of a jian, and then just pick up these two things and come together in dialogue.
Yes.
And I think that is definitely contemporary and very, very cool.
Yeah, and in a way, it gives this sport more relevance to modern day people, right? Even though it's based on something like we said, as it gets further and further away, it might not even ever be associated with that particular franchise. Remember, Star Wars is not the only sci-fi property that has laser swords. I mean, they're just the ones that everybody knows about. But regardless, you know, at this I think sport can move into the future because of these things. It's kind of the shackles of having, even like the conceit that there is some sort of practical reason, like with the saber being the upper body, or even like Guandao. If we bring in Guandao is, you know, a glaive like that is mainly a cavalry weapon. So much of those forms are done in horse stance and are just done like this, because all you're trying to do is practice keeping that weapon from chopping off your own horse's head, you know, as you are defending yourself. You know, so, you know, I think this frees us up from a lot of those conceits. And if we can really latch onto those as its own thing, which I think is definitely possible. And recently I feel like it's really come into its own, to where they, you know, yes, the the techniques are the same and stuff like that, but people, and I get people kind of moving over there, but people still view lightsaber as its own thing, right? And some people, I wish Michael was here today because that was his first martial art, was lightsaber. So
there's a lot of people like that. A lot of people I taught in New York, they didn't know any martial arts, and it inspires them to do so much more, whatever that is, you know. And it is a you know, the next step in a larger world, right?
yeah, Fabrice, what would you say is the dominant type of person who is coming to lightsaber classes at your club or something? Is it somebody who's interested in the kind of Star Wars aspect of it, into the sport aspect of it? What seems to be the biggest draw there?
Okay. Most of them are not fencer. There are different people who love Olympic fencing and the one who love lightsaber. Okay. Yeah. Most of them prefer a choreography approach, and the second part prefer the competitive approach. The reason, because the competitive approach is really growing up in France, because the French Federation wants to make understand the lightsaber is not a toy. It's a true weapon. It's a true martial arts with its own rules, its own way to practice, to learn, and so on. So it's very difficult, even for my colleague in France. When I say I will open a lightsaber class, they say, "Hey, Fabrice, you're insane." Most of them are younger people, as you said, so they don't know even about Star Wars. Wow. The old one, as I am, knows everything about Star Wars because we were born with it.
Right.
But the younger ones practice lightsaber, and later on they will get involved into Star Wars, but not necessary. They don't want a sports approach, but as they want to learn the move, TPLA move, and so on, they want to practice, they begin training, and they get involved in kind of sporting way.
Right. Yep. So that's good to know.
I have just a question. You talk about kids. What kind of lightsaber you use with your class with kids?
Oh, well, okay. So I would do younglings classes, which were from 5 to, well, kids could take it up to 12. And then,
yeah.
Right. And for a while we would just use regular lightsabers, but we would not do any contact or anything like that. They would just do swarms and drills and stuff like that. When I got the Misty Forge foam ones, I started using those. Right, because I liked those foam ones. Unfortunately, Misty Forge is not together anymore, and I want to get those produced again because those were really good. They didn't have the usual boffer problems. So then I would use those. If you have like just regular, my opinion is if you just have regular lightsabers, don't do any contact with them unless you can like get them down and gear them up and and all that. But since most of this gear is made for adults and it doesn't really fit kids, not the greatest idea. If you have foam sabers or boffers or something like that, that you can kind of go in there. But as far as kids goes, especially like from the 5 to 8 range, they just want to move that thing around and have fun. They're not going to really retain any technique. So it's usually, I usually just hand it to them. We go through some drills, we do some fun stuff, and
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody else does a kids class that can. Oh yeah, Damon, you do kids.
Yeah, I mean, I teach, but I don't teach them lightsaber yet. But I do teach them a combination of martial arts and parkour through a franchise called Ninja Zone. And that brings, I mean, and if I added a LED saber to that, my God, it'd be so much fun. And it is hard to keep them to retain like formulaic movements, like a form. However, when you teach them essential basics, when you teach them like the Jibangang of parkour, let's say, rolls and leaps and all that kind of stuff, they retain that really, really well, especially when we have a rig that we can jump on. So I could imagine that instead of trying to concentrate on forms and stuff with them, we get them doing just singular techniques, which is I'm sure we naturally would go into. I think teaching kids is great, and it gives them a real sense of empowerment, understanding of just being in their body, just makes them more embodied, makes them more physical, and just makes them really a lot more aware of the surroundings, which is super important.
And what's really important for youth training too is the aspect of play. And this gives great aspects of play, where they can really explore their bodies, their physicality, and be creative about it and engage.
Again, it comes back to the story that you all were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And the choreography or the myths of the weapons, as Gene was talking about, and I think it's one thing is super important, especially when I teach my kids, is I always have stories to tell them too, so they can write their own.
Right.
So they can be empowered to have their own. And I think that creative force behind the lightsaber is definitely a new thing, because I don't see a lot of people writing new tales about, I mean, people try to do like the new Monkey King, but I don't see someone trying to write a new tale about his staff.
Yeah, old new sword play.
Exactly.
Stuff. Like you could update the Three Musketeers, but could you create a new Three Musketeers? I don't know.
I think there's an interesting connection between, I did some work studying with capoeira.
Oh.
And capoeira has a story,
yeah,
about how it was, a form of fighting that was disguised as dancing, by the slaves that came to Brazil, and there's a lot of choreography in it, and there's a lot of, and they practice a lot of that, and I think that and it's developed into its own, legit martial art, and I think that that's a big part of what capoeira places do, is they teach people about the history of it, but it doesn't, but then it evolves into something more at the individual level when they start getting into it.
Yeah, I mean, and you get named in capoeira, you get a capoeira name, you learn music, and there's a whole beautiful thing in that art, which I think brings its story into it. That's awesome, Serge.
Yeah, no, those aspects of bringing it in, and we can bring that stuff in, with sabering, so much.
And the thing is that in fencing, today it's very hard to start someone in traditional fencing, Olympic fencing, without putting a foil or an épée or a saber in their hand, in a kid's hand, within the first couple of weeks of doing it. But historically, for example, in France, kids would take up fencing and they wouldn't be able to hold a weapon for 6 months or more. They would be working on footwork.
Yep.
And I think that element too, it's so hard to keep a lightsaber out of a kid's hand, You know, I mean, if doing it for 6 months, I mean, there's no way you could do that, right? But I think that it's very important to establish the elements of choreography or footwork or handwork or whatever it is before they get that. And so if you can stage and phase that in a way that makes it enticing and really rewards them with the ability and that they've earned the right to use the lightsaber because they've gotten to a certain level of accomplishment in the other areas that are essential to being able to perform the actions, then, you know, and because we just want to basically hand a kid a lightsaber and say, okay, go start whacking each other, right? But that's not a good way to teach any sort of sport.
And that's
Well,
where
was
that
it-
story, that's where that story can kind of come in, because
Exactly.
we can inform that process of, like, you know, if you want to earn this, you can go through like a Jedi. A Jedi doesn't get his lightsaber on his first day, and you have these ready-made examples that you can then use as teaching moments, right? Just like you could with old traditional folklore and all of that kind of thing. Right.
So, Chad, can I ask a question? So,
Yeah, please.
how do we so to our three panelists? So that's a lot of. We have the old school. Okay, you're going to get thrown for 6 months before you learn anything. You're not going to do, you know. And then we have the new school where we put the thing right in the hand and we go. What are the things that we can learn from the arts that you've studied in the past, whether they're sporting, whether they're traditional, whether they're choreographic, that you think could be good tools to help us as teachers and other teachers who are unfamiliar with that type of training, bridge the gap between that old paradigm and the new worldview?
Yeah, Gene, I want to hear what you want to say, what you have to say about this particular question first. I don't mean to put, but I'm particularly interested in your answer.
Well, I mean, it's tough to break from the Star Wars canon, and I think, I mean, that's a great stepping stone. I mean, you know, I mean, you give me this thing, and I want it in my hands. I'm not going to do footwork. I want to play with this thing, no matter what. You know, I want to turn it on. I want to swing it around. I want to do all that great stuff. But I mean, I see where you guys have developed the forms, you know, and so I mean, I think traditionally speaking, I don't think those rules really apply in the same way. You know, the main appeal of sabering is that it's intrinsically fun, you know, which isn't necessarily the situation in traditional martial arts. Quite the opposite, actually.
Right.
It's hardship. It's hardship, and so, you know, traditionally in Kung Fu you'd spend, you know, months just sitting in horse stance, which really sucks. You know, and even traditional Tai Chi, just, you know, hold Dong for months, which, you know, and that would just weed people out, because that was a different trip when you were thinking about it applicatively, you know, in the sense of like, you know, we're training our militia here in the village, you know, we're training you how to fight, or you're going to become part of the clan, and we're going to, you know, we're going to have our own private militia. You know, with something like sabering, I mean, all bets are off, really, in terms of, I think you really got to work the appeal of the weapon itself, you know, or what you've got. You know, there's just something intrinsically fun about a glowing sword, right? And I mean, everybody feels it, you know, and I don't really know what that is exactly, but you got to work that. I mean, in terms of doing it traditionally, you know, and I hear what Serge is saying about, you know, the old school way we used to do fencing, man. I mean, how many lunges did I have to do back in the day? You know, that's the hard work of it. And I guess
it's a hard line to walk between doing what you have to do. Like, you know, if you want your students to be safe, you have to teach them a certain amount of basics and a certain amount of this. And yet, like you said, you have to keep it fun and everything. I have found that this is great, because all you have to do is turn it on and people are entertained. So they can sit there and just hold it out in front of them and do footwork, and they still feel like they're using a lightsaber. So
Sure, and then you got the variation between artistic, like artistic fencing versus sport fencing.
right.
Where you're doing choreography, which can be taught in a much safer way than anything combative, because combative, you're going to push beyond your physical abilities because you want to beat the other guy, right? Whereas something that's more like in Chinese martial arts, what we call duilian, partner practice or double practice, where you're doing sparring forms or pre-choreographed things, artistic fencing, if you will. That's more of a cooperative effort. I'm not trying, I'm trying to make it look good, but I'm not trying to best my partner. I'm trying to work with my partner and make it look as convincing as possible.
Much more choreographed. It's in theatrical. The hard thing, but to be able to combine theatrical and sport fencing is the fact that in theatrical fencing, the objective is for me not to hit you.
Right.
Whereas in real fencing,
martial arts,
hit you. I think that but everything. I mean, in music, you have to learn your arpeggios and your scales, and before you can start playing actual pieces of music that people want to listen to, right? And every sport, I mean, you can't just throw a parachute on somebody and shove them out of a plane either, right? You got to train people in something before they can start doing it. The question is, how long is that, and what is the defined curriculum that takes them through these steps that they do for just long enough that they don't get bored out of their minds, and then they get the reward of starting to actually use and start to perform the actual object of their desire.
Yep.
I mean, I think one thing that the martial arts do with weapons, and maybe this is because I was more old school. I mean, the weapons were weapons. I mean, even with the shinai, I would never hold a shinai like this in kendo.
Right.
You've got to respect the blade. I've got to know where the blade is. I can't rest it like this, like a cane or anything, because that's just disrespectful for the weapon, right? And then when you're working with an actual sharp, like in the Ido, you can cut off your ear if you mess up. It's really easy. Now with this, I mean, it is intrinsically a toy, right? So, I mean, do you teach respect for the weapon? I mean, how does that really work? I mean, in the films, right, or in the, I can't do this. This is like hot or cold or
right.
Force stuff. I can burn through doors with it.
I think when
I guess that gets into my earlier question about the sport.
Well, it's also about developing the physical abilities. We have parents who come to us at the fencing club who want to put a 5-year-old into fencing, and they're just not capable of holding the weapon. I mean, when I was 8 or 9 years old, my dad, who was had grown up fencing competitively in France, he had me hold a broomstick out at the end of the broomstick until I was just like in pain, right? But he wanted me to develop the ability to hold something that way, and to develop the muscle structure and that sort of thing. And so there's that physical element of this too, where you want kids to have the physical ability to sustain the activity.
Yes, absolutely.
And if they're coming from playing video games all day long and they're not into any sport, and this is their alternative sport, you might have a longer road to hoe than you would if they were coming from another sport into your sport.
I actually want to add something to that. I wish Gene was still around.
Yeah, hopefully he'll come back here. I'm going to try to get a hold of him again.
Okay. It's interesting because it's you have to kind of devise a way to keep people entertained. I don't view lightsaber the same way I view the traditional martial art that I teach. I just don't. Ben has known me for quite a while now, and he hears me all the time say, you got to keep it fun, got to keep it fun. So yeah, that's an interesting riddle to solve, because if they want to take it to that level, I will help them, but I'm much more lighthearted about it. You know, it's Star Wars, it's lightsaber, it's fun. If they want to take it further, I'm great with that. But if they're just cool with going like this and having fun, and I try to weed it in a little bit, that's great. But I try to control myself from being Mr. Kung Fu teacher when it comes to teaching class, when it comes to lightsaber.
That's true. Yeah, there. I mean, like I said, it's a fine line to walk between, you know, giving the basics that that people need just to be safe, you know, and to keep people integrated. Yeah. We lost Gene here, kind of in the middle of his sentence. He froze up. He might have lost internet. I don't know. If he comes back in, we'll let him in, but we can kind of keep going there. How about Fabrice? What's your view, your personal view on this particular line that we're walking between teaching good foundation and making sure that we're not taking ourselves too seriously, I guess?
Even in nowadays, even in Olympic fencing, my fencing is a saber club. We got to mix in class. We mix footworks, fun. We alternate the situation to get the student open mind and ready to continue. In lightsabering particularly, I think first they play, then they want to understand and to grow up, and then we start studying the Dulong and so on to understand the practice, understand the way, the forms, and TPLA way of progression is a great aid for us. Because you can take a part of one of our Dulan and our velocities and so on, and you can make them understand the way, the movements, the balance of the body, the why, the reason why the footworks is. So with younger people, even with adults, it's a very fun approach in the first class. But with the adults, it comes very quickly. They want to understand, they want to improve the movements. Even in sports, in competitive lightsabering, because they want to win, they want to progress. Personally, I begin my class with just a little play, and then footworks with lightsaber, footworks Dulong, 2 partners, and then the team of my science.
Yeah.
And so on. Voilà.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean that's one of the things. Gene is having connectivity problems, so we'll hopefully he'll get those fixed up. But like the system that we have with the accelerations and, you know, up through these things is really meant to give you like the both of best worlds. It should be fun, but it should also give you the basics. And the way we're kind of doing that is by like utilizing, again, that story or the imagination of thinking of, this is real. I'm really going through this. Just like everything that Galaxy's Edge is based on, right? When you go there, you want to feel like you're in it. Like it's not a fantasy, it's real. And I think all of these efforts that we're talking about today, even the ones that aren't directly talking about fictionalizing stuff, but with the sport and all that, give us this stage in which we bring whatever we want to it, whether it's just a simple story of competition and winning and losing, or it's a complicated story that's happening within ourselves, to push us forward. All right. Do we want to take some questions from the internet?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Hopefully Gene will come back in here and he'll jump in there as well. So Matthew, why don't you pick something for us there, since you were the one.
Yep. Let me flip over. I asked people to start making notes of questions they want to ask, and while we are waiting for the delay between our talking and their being able to view it,
Right.
Someone raised the question of what do they tell people that, let me read it directly. What do I tell people that I'm training in lightsaber based on traditional martial arts? What exactly is it, or is it considered its own entity?
I think the argument is we want it to be considered its own entity. I think, yes, I don't see any dissension from that particular point.
And one of the interesting things about this moment in history is that, lightsaber is becoming popular because it's diversified. So, it really depends on what you are practicing in your particular club and what you guys are doing, right? When we started off in 2006, it was all performance and cosplay, right? And now we have that public performance aspect, but we also have a competitive sporting aspect. Sports leagues are growing very, very quick in this space, but we have a traditional martial arts space. And in that traditional martial arts space, I know that there are kendo schools who are just bringing in, lightsabers and using them as shinai, right? So if that's the club that you're talking about, well, in that case, yeah, you may just be doing kendo with the shinai, right? It's a way to attract people into a kendo club. In TPLA space, we're trying to, make something that is a little bit more unique. Yeah, we're very firmly based in traditional martial arts, but we want something that stands on its own.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. But basics and fundamentals are absolutely important to us here. That's the whole.
I think there's a, in the same way that mixed martial arts, MMA, sort of took on a lot of interest. I think there's an element of that in this too. There's sort of a mixed history because, if you look at how in Star Wars, how, they were trained by a classical saber coach to do the moves within lightsaber, and yet other elements of, you can see other elements of other martial arts in it. So I think from its origin in Star Wars, I think that it has sort of a mixed martial arts kind of element to it.
Yeah. I think there's these elements are mixing uniquely.
So I think how you explain that to people, I think again, this returns to what you guys were saying about a story. I think having a crafted story, a crafted history that everybody sort of agrees is on what it is. I think that's a good place to start. And for us as the sort of pioneers of this area as a sport, I think it's the onus is upon us to create that story and to write it and to present at least one form of it.
Right on.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I just saw the question. I apologize. I had something really loud going on here and I couldn't hear anything, so I had to mute my mic. Apologies. I get that question a lot, actually. What is this? And you know, I try to explain it best I can. You know, I kind of detail the various martial artists involved and the influences that help solidify what we do, and you know, the physical manifestation of what we do in lightsaber. You know, because we have so many diverse backgrounds. You know, Chinese, Japanese, you know, European, you know, and so on. So I try to my best to let them know, yeah, well, this is coming from, you know, Chinese Dadao, and you know, this is coming from Bagua, and oh, by the way, this thing that I just showed you is Filipino martial arts, you know, but we're doing it for lightsaber, and I think they really like that, because if they never heard of any of those things, usually the next question is, oh, what is that? And then it's a teaching opportunity, you know. So it's kind of like a soft approach, I think.
Yeah.
Welcome back, Gene.
Sorry
Yeah.
about that. The rebel scum
Cool.
are after me. Cut my connections. Just can't rely on the Empire anymore to keep the
No.
communication flowing, you know? What I miss.
Your credits were not accepted as a bribe.
Oh, man. You know, that's the problem with the Imperial credits versus the Galactic credits.
Yeah.
You know, get a big shakeup like that. Things get all, the economy
And
just
all of
goes
this,
backwards.
yeah, when we joke about all of this, and when we're talking about what is this kind of thing, and you see this, like I said, Galaxy's Edge, they even started like making gift cards that look like credits.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. So,
Matthew, can you read that question aloud that you just put up? That's a really good one.
oh yes.
Cyclonus 5 has asked us, what methods are in place to make sure Saber does not become over sportified or over performance emphasized? And then the question was clarified, or perhaps what is in place for keeping the aspects of performance sport what is in place for keeping the aspects of performance sport self-growth in balance with each other? I paraphrased a little bit for you. I hope I asked that correctly, Cyclonus.
My short answer is diversity. If you have a group of people training together from different backgrounds that can honor each other's way of practice, then it doesn't become a monoculture. And it's just like farming, you know what I mean? It's the same thing. We're all different roots, vegetables, or whatever. You know, if someone along the way decides to clear that out and make us all one thing to grow, then that's the danger that he's talking about. But I think as long as our conversations are respectful and open and honest, and that one expert recognizes another expert, and we come together in that sense of community and friendship, then I think organically that integration will sustain itself. That's my feeling.
I think also that orientation leads to personal style. So, you know, whatever you're coming from can be an advantage because it becomes part of your style. So, you know, if you're a gymnast who goes into another sport, you know, you can apply whatever you knew from gymnastics. You know, if you get a kid coming from karate, or you get a kid coming from fencing or any other area, you know, I think that what the coach should be doing is looking at what that child's interests are and what their abilities are, and then leveraging them into the sport so that they can perform the sport in a legitimate way and according to the rules. But as they learn the basics, then they can integrate their background into that stylistically. I mean, we see that in fencing, where people have come from judo or karate and come into fencing, you know, or from dance. You know, there's similarities. You know, we see that's helpful. I mean, and so a good coach will take that training that already exists and segue it into that sport, and then you have something unique that you can offer to, and that you can use as a competitive advantage as well.
Absolutely.
When I think competitive wise, the sport will drive itself. And as the technology and rules tighten up, you know, people will fit, because the bottom line in competition is you want to win. And so, like, we do our, I run a major tournament as part of Tire Claw, and I've done that for well over a decade now. And, in Chinese martial arts, I mean, wushu, competitive wushu does have a rule set because they're trying to be Olympic. Traditional martial arts, it's kind of seat of our pants, it's very subjective. We do have rule sets and we refine that every year. But I mean, it's nothing, you don't know how much, Serge, you don't know how many times I've pulled out my old, US FCA rule books or AFLA, I'm dating myself there, AFLA, rule books and say, look at this. This is the rule books for a real sport. Look how thick this is. Look how well everything's covered. I mean, like one of my major sticking points with modern wushu is that the weapons, we do have competition weapons, but the specs have never been published. The way a competition weapon exists in this position, it's an IF, it's an international federation, and they try to become an Olympic sport in Beijing, but the way the weapons are defined, it's the company that makes it. So one company gets the license, but there's no specs, unlike fencing where, every spec, every millimeter is laid out. And that's true for any sport, for any weapon, And so that becomes kind of a thing like, do you want to go there as you formalize it? I mean, you've got to level the playing field, right? At the same time, you look at something like Kendo, where the rules aren't as rigid on the weapons and such, that it's, so I guess my point with sportification is, if you're a wise competitor, your rules. And the people that I respect most, and actually the biggest pain in my butt when I'm running my martial arts tournaments, are the ones that know the rules and will call me out on a loophole, and say, hey, this is a loophole, or this is how I'm going to win. I'm going to take advantage of this loophole. And I respect that. I so respect that because they understand it's a game and they let that game define it. They don't really try to put this whole, oh, we're really symbolic fighting or what have you. And in terms of performance, on the other hand, I mean, it's derivative of these films. I mean, sure, you want to divorce from that, but the performance is like wide open. I don't know how authenticity in Star Wars performance really gets. I mean, maybe you mimic some of the moves. I mean, again, to cite Trials of the Dark Saber, they had that basic form that Kanan teaches Sabine, right? It's like what is it? Just a handful of moves, but then they develop into a sparring form, which is kind of, when I first saw that, I was like, man, that's kind of like canon. They're laying something out. But so I look at somebody like look at it like, all right, so there I got to plug this, right? Ray Park, right? Ray Park was inspired by Empire. It was one of the first movies he saw in London. And that is what got him into gymnastics, because he saw Yoda training Luke, and it was like, oh, this is what I want to do. And then from that was a stepping stone to the martial arts. Then he became part of the British Wushu team. And then he became Darth Maul, which I will often argue is one of the greatest villains, given how small his original part was, and really the only redemption of the first film, or episode 1, in my opinion. So here you have this guy that, really became part of it. I mean, he actually did the mocap for Siege of Mandalore, right? For the new Clone Wars films. And he was the one that actually threw in the barrel roll, the Wushu barrel roll. That was never in his original choreography. The choreography, but he kind of wanted to sneak in because he was a Wushu guy, and he's a friend. He's a very dedicated martial artist. I don't know if you guys have met him in his travels.
Yeah, I've met him.
What a gentleman.
Yeah. The one thing that I remember about about Phantom Menace when I saw it, because I knew who Ray Park was, I knew Wushu, everything like that. So I was like, and then when I saw those fights, I was like, what? Because there was only that one, the one little butterfly twist in there. Everything else was just, they're like this big in the frame.
Yeah.
We're way out.
I guess that's sort of my point to the whole thing about artistic interpretation is that, it's very wide open. We are somewhat defined by this major franchise and how it looked, but there's no reason why it can't go just all crazy, or just do, as the rules change, people will start to learn different things. I mean, I can remember when, and maybe I'm dating myself again, Serge, you'll have to check me on this, but like the whole point when we were able to do whip overs, and because just the nature of the weapon, the flexibility is something you could never really do with a real fencing sword, but the way the game was played, we could do it. And now with Saber, you can get hit with the flat. So, but that's the nature of the game, as long as that level field is that playing field is level and sporting, you're okay. That's the whole point. It's safe and that it's equal. In terms of validity, I mean, I'm kind of actually looking forward to people coming up with some crazy lightsaber move that would just totally not exist in all our other conventional swordplay. That would not exist in fencing or kung fu or kendo.
Maybe.
Let me go ahead. Did you want to say?
Oh, Chad? Yeah. I was going to say that with the, I'm going to push back a little bit on this idea that the sport performance and all of that kind of thing has to be in balance, because we shouldn't be thinking about performance when we're thinking about the sport. The sport is its own thing and the performance is its own thing, right? Now, if we're talking about training, how are we training? You look at your context and you go, you train for what you are training for. So the idea that we have to keep, like, I don't know that I understand where the idea of over sportification comes from, right? That we're still kind of holding on to this kind of ideal, this imaginary ideal of how this particular fight is supposed to go. But like, as we were saying, when you're in a sport, it is a sport, it has its own rules, and you work it that way. So whereas, okay, yes, does modern Olympic épée look very much like small sword dueling back in the 1800s? Oh, probably not. But I don't think that even matters. I don't think that I think that's a question that we end up asking ourselves for no good reason. Whereas all of these things can coexist, and as long as we bring the same level of professionalism and care to the training of these particular things, I think that's really for me, that's the important part of it.
Chad, while I agree with you, I think I get where the logic of this type of question comes from, right? So people are thinking not necessarily about historic, fighting. They're thinking about how they understand historic martial arts, or how they understand specifically traditional Asian martial arts, where we put a lot of emphasis on there being a moral or philosophical aspect to it, right? That, we don't torture little Japanese children in kendo classes because we really want them to be kendo champions. We torture little Japanese children because we want them to become proper Japanese adults, right? And this is where you learn those moral and ethical lessons that will allow you to be tortured as a proper salaryman when you grow up, right? And so when they say, I'm worried about over sportification, what they're really saying is, wait a second, is there still going to be that aspect of, character development and, values? Is this still going to be a system that promotes a recognizable value structure?
Totally agree with you. And I think the other concept that plays in with the martial arts is that sense of, will it work on the street, which is really sort of an absurd preposition, we strive for that validity in combat. Is this a real technique, or are they just kind of play fighting? My techniques are too deadly for the cage. We've all heard that kind of stuff in the martial arts world, but here, all bets are off, which is, I think, to me, the most exciting thing about this notion is that, sure, we've got these other traditions, kendo and fencing and kung fu and all these other sword traditions, but that feed into, naturally into what we're doing. But at the same time, it's a wide open thing. It's a whole new galaxy of opportunity in terms of how this could play out, right? And a lot of that will be defined by how the rule set is shaped. You know, I mean, you really won't feel it. I mean, I'm sure, you know, again, Serge will back me up on this, I'm sure, is that, you know, rules evolve, you know, and there's constant changes, constant updates, because you know, people figure out ways to cheat, or people figure out, you know, issues with the rules, or that, you know, particularly with fencing, the tech changes. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what makes it a vital sport, right? I mean, even within gymnastics or baseball or any sport, they're constantly on the move. And I think a lot of traditionalists in martial arts kind of get hung up on, you know, the old way is good, you know, no change, you know, maintain the tradition. But when you get to a sport, it's a whole different animal, you know, it's a whole different animal.
Let me pose a question for everybody. What, given that that fencing is sort of, at least in France, adopting LED saber as an event and a sport, what if it were judged a little differently, other than just scoring points on an opponent? What if there was an element of winning based on subjectivity and style?
Which existed in old traditional fencing and exists in kendo.
Like, and I believe Ludo Sport has some manner of style points they award as well. Is it correct?
Yes, Ludo Sport absolutely does, and they're very important to Ludo Sport competitors. It's, for them, it's almost just as big a deal as, you know, who wins in the war points category.
They have that category in gymnastics and ice skating too, right? There's all the different strata. I guess it would be, you know, I guess it would be how to.
Well, but isn't
someone
that
just has to create it?
But that's also true in boxing.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And you know what? I think too, like, we've been experimenting before the whole pandemic thing with applying the FFE rule set in a timed manner. So you basically have 3 judges, like in boxing, that are separately taking scores. And then at the end of the round, you tally up the scores. And that would be probably someplace just like boxing, where you could put in those style points that would differentiate from people who are like getting lucky shots or because of slop, and people who are making clean hits and you know, doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think you're right, Chad. You need more than one person watching that.
Oh yeah,
that
definitely.
turns it into a do like kendo as versus jiu-jitsu, which you know, when you use the character do, it elevates, right? Judo versus jiu-jitsu, you've got much more, you're going for that perfect form in a do, whereas in a jitsu, you're, you know, sloppy points, lucky hits, you know, on the street, that totally counts, right? So those have to be figured out. You know, when I failed to qualify for my last JOs, because I was just about to age out, I was fencing this one kid, and I totally had him beat, but he kept hitting me with these lucky shots. And the final shot, I had him totally lined up, and I do this flesh, and I extend out, and he trips because I had his footwork nailed, but I just couldn't place the point. And as he's falling, tripping, his weapon flips up and catches me on the wrist, and I'm out. And so, you know, that was a brutal lesson, because that actually, you know, that was that knocked me out of nationals, and it happens all the time.
I would have argued that, because he lost control and you fencing out of control, which you know, it would have annulled the point if I would have complained.
You know, I was 19, so I didn't know, and it was humiliating to get hit that way. You know, he hadn't hit the ground, right? He was literally flailing and falling back, and he just caught me, and then he hit the ground.
Like Achilles versus Hector, man. Don't trip over the rock.
Right, exactly.
Well, no, total aside, I'll just do this real quick. And then we got a question that I want to direct towards Serge and Fabrice here as we close up here. But well, actually, why don't we just get to that one? We'll move on to that. We'll do that one later. But anyway, so we're talking about the sport. We're talking about it going up here, and we've got a question here. I believe this is from the forum here, or from the people. Could lightsaber eventually be embraced or recognized as a legitimate sport? Now, technically, it already has in France, but but why don't we open it up? Like, Serge, if we're gonna, if this wants to go to the Olympics, if this wants to go to international type acceptance, what's the road in front of
Well, I
it?
would say it's already on the road. That doesn't mean it'll happen, but
Sure.
you know, sports in the Olympics are, you first become an exhibition sport. You know, like what happened with, again, back to snowboarding or skateboarding, or, you know, they bring these sports in and they start at the bottom level. I mean, in the Olympics, we have 5 levels, A, B, C, D, E, of categorization of sports. In the category A, you have very few sports. It's like, I don't know, swimming and track and field and something else. And a lot of that is based on optics. It's based on how much TV coverage you're able to get for that, you know, how much money it brings in. You know, there's a lot that goes into it, but a lot of it's based on the interest and the image and that sort of thing. And everybody, and the vast majority of sports are in the D category, trying to creep their way into C. So, for example, archery, about 6 or 7 years ago, made it from the D category up into the C category, because they actually completely revamped. They fired their president. They revamped their marketing materials and marketing method and everything else. And they sort of, you know, reimagined the entire sport, and it became much more popular. And as a result, they were able to move up in the world that way. Fencing has been on the same sort of track. It's been a D sport, but moving up. You may have seen that wrestling a few years ago went backwards. They dropped down into the E category and were actually out for a while, and then they got back in. And and you think wrestling, you know, given the history of you know, Roman times and wrestling and all that it would not happen, but it did. So there's a process that sports go through, and the first part of that process is to become accepted as an exhibition sport, where it doesn't really count if you win an event at an exhibition sport. You don't really have bragging rights as a true Olympic champion, you know. And so that would be the first step, is to get it going in that category. Once it has enough you know, general interest and support and involvement, and enough countries involved to legitimize it that way. I mean, I don't think it would be very easy to do with just 2 or 3 countries. If the US and France and Italy did it, for example, that's not enough. You've got to get a critical mass of interest and support before you can even become an exhibition sport. So, and consistency. So that would be the process as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I've actually spoken to people at the IOC about this, and they are fascinated by it, and they're interested. And the fact that we have a president of the IOC who's a fencer, you know, doesn't hurt. But the process nonetheless is pretty involved, and it's going to take some time before we get to that point, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah,
What do you think we should be concentrating on as we're trying to get the sport more accepted out there?
Consistency and reach, and just grassroots education, and just getting as many people and as many countries involved, and doing everything possible to make it so that they can get that sport going in their countries, and getting enough of a critical mass there that it you know, you get a groundswell of interest, and then everything starts to move in that direction. I think that's what we've got to start doing the most. It's education and information and publicity.
Yeah. All right. In France, we are working with Belgian fencing academies. We are trying to work with Luxembourg Academy. So it follows its way on Europe.
Yes. Well,
I followed the advancement of wushu very closely over the past couple of years. I think the Olympics is the main event, and you got to fight on the undercard before you even start talking about the Olympics.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of smaller games, you know, like the Asian Games or the Pan Americans or the Universiade, you know, that have to kind of get them before that. And I think to even be considered for what Serge is talking about, you have to become an IF, an international federation, which has a minimum, and I'm blocking right now. It's either like 80 or 120 countries need to be participating to get that established. And there has, there's
I don't know the number. Fencing, we have 157 federations, but
yeah. So
I think it's probably less than that, but I don't know for sure.
and so it's, the Olympics is a huge process. I think at this point, that's way, because there's so many sports trying to get in.
Yeah.
Ballroom dancing almost made it in when we had it in Australia, which
at one point bridge almost made it in.
Right. And then you look at like some of the Asian games, like they have esports, and I think they actually do have like bridge or chess or some of the other kind of odd games are there's so many other smaller games that would have to be approached first.
And some sports
are actually achievable.
Yeah, and some sports have come out, I mean, like baseball at the Athens Olympics was a miserable failure.
Yeah, and Taekwondo is teetering because, I mean, they've always been teetering from the very get-go, and the electrification of Taekwondo got so weird. I mean, I first thought the electrification of Saber got weird, but the electrification of Taekwondo is, I can't even follow it, and I follow sport, I follow fight games all the time. It's like, what is it? It's even more confusing to watch than point sparring because it's so fast, and you just got to make that.
Well, one thing that helps is if it becomes associated with an existing legitimized federation as opposed to trying to be one on its own, which is why the French Federation angle is a good one. And that's like, again, I return to snowboarding, which is what helped snowboarding is to become part of skiing. Once the FIS recognized snowboarding as a legitimate sport within its cadre of events, then that just made it skyrocket, right? I mean, of course, it already had a lot of people doing it around the world.
Yeah. Totally.
I'm curious, how much crossover is there between you guys and Ludosport? Ludosport's the other kind of big dog in this, right?
Well, they're one of them. They've gotten they've had a different model. They had a marketing model which was based kind of like on a franchise-ish type of thing. Ben could probably talk more about the specifics of that, but as far as our relationship with them, we don't have a whole lot of relationship with them. I used to know those guys, Hugo and Simone, but I haven't talked to them in quite some time. They've been on the program a couple of times, and we used to go back and forth, but I haven't talked to them in a while. Do you have anything?
Yeah, so they have a franchising kind of a model where you buy an academy and then you can set up schools underneath yourself. Obviously, they're a huge deal in Italy and Southern Europe. The main difference that you'll see is in their sparring. They don't wear fencing helmets or fencing gear, right? So they're kind of like a very, very, very light touch or kind of a no touch control game. Whereas most of the other, lightsaber leagues, and there are a number like the Saber Legion and Lightspeed. So there are a number of saber leagues. I think every other league at this point, has either a medium amount of armor or a heavy amount of armor. I think Ludosport is the only one that you'll see where people are kind of competing without face masks or serious gloves at this point.
Interesting. I mean, this may sound kind of naive to you guys because I've yet to be hit by an LED saber, but
you do not want to be hit by an LED saber in the head. It will resolve very quickly any questions you have as to whether this is a real weapon. It will become really clear.
They can cause serious damage. There was a person in New York City who lost their teeth because they took a saber to the mouth.
Yeah, we had an incident earlier. We had an incident earlier in this year where somebody got a knock on the head and through a fencing helmet got enough there that they kind of passed out for a little bit. So they're substantial. I've broken this pinky while wearing a glove, the pinky tip, just from getting a tap right there. That a lot of this has to do with the hilt being metal, right? And the fact that we're using lacrosse gloves, which generally do not have any padding whatsoever on the bottom of the palm. My toning gloves, these have that's one of the reasons I like them, is because they have, it's all enclosed, so there's a little bit of shock absorption. But yeah, they're serious. Taking out teeth is no problem. Getting it in the eye would really suck. Breaking any of these little bones right here, which is
Chad, you did a wonderful series a few years ago where you smashed stuff.
yeah, other
The dummy heads, and it was a wonderful video. Gene, I think you'd find it very interesting.
I'll have to look that up.
Very detailed in his breaking of stuff. Must have been a fun day.
Curiously, have there been, I mean, not just within your organization, but within sabering in general, have there been a lot of injuries? Have there been any deaths?
No, we haven't had anything like that. So for me, I haven't had a whole lot of injuries. We had one concussion because somebody was swinging too hard, right? Now we haven't had any problems with that. Recently, we put in all that stuff. The new FFE rule set and even our Duanbing rule set have provisions to prevent, really, really hard hitting.
Sure, that's key to it, right?
Indirectly, over the years, as we were really pushing for people to use protective gear, we watched other groups and people involved in the various communities begin to adopt more and more protective safety features. So while we don't have any real numbers, we could probably make a reasonable hypothesis that as more people have gotten involved without safety gear and then transitioned, there was some connection there.
Yeah, I think people
I can say after having been to a number of tournaments that all lightsaber fencing seems relatively safe compared to almost any other combat sport that you're going to encounter. So just laying that out there, as martial arts go, this is a pretty safe one. The thing that seems to be most likely to cause injury in lightsaber fencing is you tripping and hitting the ground, because the ground never misses. That is the thing that consistently gets people. Losing your feet.
True in any sport, though, right?
Yeah.
Oh, Serge, I think you're muted.
And fencing is statistically safer than badminton and golf. So.
Right. Yep.
Nice.
Yes. Yeah. All of this stuff is. And remember, as I've said here many times in the past here, statistically speaking, you are far more likely to be run through with a sword in a play than any other place. So
sure,
you go ferret out the reality in that particular fact.
Right.
So
we're getting props from the comment group on our importance of gear series in the YouTube video library.
Excellent. Very good. Yes, we're going to be doing more gear stuff pretty soon. All right. Well, we're kind of at the end of the time here. I'm glad all three of you made it through here. Do you guys have anything else you wanna leave us with here before we end the stream?
Actually, in France, we are working for true and adapt really make for lightsabering equipment safety. Okay. Yes. Actually, we use IME safety, OK safety, fencing mask, but we want protective gears made for lightsabering, because it's a way to give lightsaber his own identity.
Yes.
Yeah. So we are working with engineer schools in France to develop, to try to find some really effective gears.
Yeah, we've actually got a lot of ideas about that kind of thing, which we're going to be getting into pretty soon, as far as gear for specific for lightsaber. Obviously, me and Matt have been thinking about that since day one, so we'll be getting into that definitely more in the coming areas.
Well, and I'll just say on behalf of the International Fencing Federation as well as USA Fencing, we're watching, and we're interested, and I I don't know the timing of the path forward, but we have to see this. You know, we can't ignore it, because I think that it has momentum and it has potential, and especially right now, like I said, where we're, you know, the world is sort of evolving a little bit because of the drama this year with the pandemic and everything else. I think that we have some opportunities to create something new and exciting and fun, and that will build over the coming years. So I'm very excited, and I'm optimistic and hopeful about the opportunities that we all have in this area.
Absolutely.
I think my parting comment would be, I mean, when I brought up that I was going to be on part of this, one of my Kung Fu brothers was just like, what? Because he had not heard any of this at all, right? And so there's going to be, you know, detractors all the way through. And, you know, what I say to martial artists all the time, I mean, just enjoy your practice. Just do your thing. Don't worry about what other people think, because that's not really what this is about. You know, you just you know, embody it, embrace it, you know, express through it, and stay healthy and be safe.
Yeah. And remember, these, even if you're doing a legitimate traditional martial art, it has benefits for you in the modern world, but its original purpose is gone. You know, we are anachronisms in a lot of these ways, and this is a way that we can make it this less of an anachronism, because it has things that I think people latch on to universally.
We're a Back to the Future anachronism.
Yeah, there you go. Right. We're back
to the galaxy far, far away, so you know we don't know what time.
Far away, a long time ago. So we're kind of like Back to the Future in the past. It's a really confusing little jump there. All right. Well, here we are at the end of it. I think this is a good place to cap it here. Let me thank all of our guests. Thank you, Fabrice, Serge, Gene. It was great having you all here. It was a great discussion. Thank you, everybody, for joining in and watching us on the interwebs. Thank you to our council members, Anthony, Damon, Matthew, Ben. And we will see you around very, very soon, because we're going to be coming up with a lot of stuff. There's going to be some announcements this week. Other than that, I will thank again our panel. We will see you next time. Patience, practice, perseverance. Happy sabering.
Thank you.
Happy Independence Day.
Happy.
Stay safe, everyone.
Thanks.
Stay safe.
Yep.